I don't go anywhere without my own props. This is great, and I'm thrilled to be part of a TEDx here, but I've always kind of traveled with a lot of baggage. My mother was famous for collecting Hollywood memorabilia, and so I think I know how to work this. Oh, I see the play button. That should be easy enough. As he said, I'm Princess Leia's brother, speaking of science fiction, as our prior speaker was talking about. A little kid came up to me one day and said, "If you're Princess Leia's brother, then you're Luke Skywalker." I said, sort of. It was interesting because Carrie didn't really connect with who she was in terms of how important she was to all of us, all the fans, until way later in her life. And this gets to why I'm here, which is to talk about storytelling. And storytelling's been around for thousands of years, and so let's see if I can get a slide up here. Aha, there, that's my title, that's what I'm talking about. But obviously thousands of years ago, people would sit around in front of campfires, and the most revered people of all were the storytellers, and they would tell you great stories of the ancestors and great accomplishments. And obviously this is a biblical scene, one of the greatest storytellers of all time, and that went on to become the Holy Bible. And these stories have been handed down through thousands of years. And at a certain point, it wasn't enough to sit on a bunch of rocks and tell a story around a campfire, so we built these giant theaters. That's how important it was. And of course, here I am in a giant theater doing the same kind of thing. So it is so important to all societies and all cultures. And there's Rome later on, and many of these theaters still exist to this day. But what was so important about this was they were handing down these beautiful stories of the human condition and romance and even wars and great valor. And those things were doing what? They were inspiring us, as our prior speaker was talking about superheroes. But these are real people, and a lot of those stories were taken and made into superheroes. Later, way later, we got printing. But this was, if you can see my slide now, was all hand done, and nobody could afford that. It's very expensive to get these books, and then even some of the books were hand-painted pictures to help tell these stories. But yeah, it was cool because now these stories didn't have to be remembered by these people. They were the story caregivers. They would remember these stories and hand them down to generations. But now a book could do that. Later, we got even more books, and eventually we get to photography. This was a monumental breakthrough, the idea that you could freeze and capture time. And in hundreds of years forward, we would be able to see images of presidents. Really, that's him. You know, we see a painting and you go, that's cool, but that's an artist's interpretation. This captured and froze time. How about the Sioux Indians? Those stories. Now, this is when it's going on. This is before movies. We're just looking at stills, and somebody's sitting around thinking, wouldn't it be cool if these things could move? So, thus brings us to Charlie Chaplin. Now, this little baby over here is actually Charlie Chaplin's camera from Estene Studios. And hard for you to see because I'm stepping out of the light. But if you listen carefully, it still works. Chaplin made many of his first films on that exact camera. There's the company. It was out of Chicago. It wasn't even Hollywood yet. To think of it, you could make movies in a town other than Hollywood? Ha, unheard of. The Tramp, we all love that. You know, and what was cool about Chaplin was that he took this new form of moving pictures, and he was one of the innovators in telling stories through these moving pictures. And then we get more complicated as time goes on, much more complicated, and eventually it gets to the point where you can actually make a movie on one of these. We don't want to break these because we all have to pay to have our screens de-done. But what's interesting is there's a movie that was just made recently. Did you catch that movie? And Soderbergh made this is an Academy Award-winning documentary as well, made on an iPhone. Why is this important? Well, if you don't have the money to buy this, which is a lot of money, although this does make great movies, and this is state-of-the-art equipment, the way the camera moves, all of this is very important, and you could make a very good argument that it makes great storytelling. It enhances the storytelling. But if you haven't got a couple $100,000 laying around, there's all kinds of stuff in between. But I find it incredible that you could make a movie on an iPhone and pull it off. By the way, my wife and I watched that movie quite by accident in a hotel room in LA the other day, and we're totally impressed, had no idea it was made on an iPhone. Now, why is this also important is that never before in time has there been so many places for you to tell your story. Never before in time has there been a place where you could buy this equipment for so little and tell your story. And look at all the places it can go. At the very least, it can go on YouTube, and phenomenon happens all the time. I mean, out of nowhere, a little girl sings to her father, and there's 20 million views, or a dog plays with a chicken, and it's why is that cool? Because it's back to that same thing when I showed you those pictures, those stories being told thousands of years ago. It's that human condition. It was funny, our prior guest was talking about comic books, and those are great stories, but there's also all of your stories, my story. And those stories inspire us to go on through life and to overcome things, which brings us to the big giant studios. They're shaking in their boots right now. Why? Because we don't need that giant studio anymore. Yes, we can make Spider-Man 12 there for $200 million, but I just showed you Soderbergh's making a movie on his iPhone and running around, for $12. So, and we paid $12 to watch it in the hotel room the other night. So, I think I like those numbers. My mother, Debbie Reynolds, for those of you who don't know who she is, she's Princess Leia's mother. And she won a Miss Burbank contest in 1948. And why is this important? Because back then, the only way to be discovered was by some fluke. You could sit on a stool at Schwab's drugstore, or maybe you could go to a beauty contest and win a screen test. And that is what my mom did. There was a free dress being given if you were a participant of a beauty contest. So she says, I'm going to go get the dress. I know I'll never win. There's a picture of her actually winning. She was leaving and heading down the street, and someone stopped her and said, you won. This led to a screen test at Warner Brothers, which led to some small movies. Didn't mean a whole heck of a lot yet. But then one day, she gets moved to MGM Studios, and a guy named Louis B. Mayer, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM, he said, I want you in Singing in the Rain. There's a picture of Gene Kelly and my mother on the set of Singing in the Rain. Why is this important? She'd never danced. She'd done some little singing. She's this little Miss Burbank. She wanted to be a gym teacher. She didn't ever dream she'd be sitting there. She was a fan more than anything else. So what happens? Gene Kelly takes her in the room with Louis B. Mayer and says, I don't want this girl. I mean, she doesn't know how to dance. I don't know anything about her. I want a professional, somebody who can carry off this part. Well, Gene Kelly is a powerful guy. He's the choreographer, director with Stanley Donen, and it's too bad, Mr. Mayer says. She's your star. So they teach her to dance. Now, you can imagine Gene Kelly might have a little chip on his shoulder about this, so he busts her chops. Now, this is good and bad, but it results in reducing my mother to having blisters on her feet that were bleeding, and during a break, she was crying under a piano. And a man walked up, and all she saw was legs, and he looks down, and it's Fred Astaire. And he reaches out, and he says, what's wrong, little girl? She's 19 years old. And she says, wow, I mean, this is difficult. My feet are bleeding, and I don't know if I can do this. And, I'm tough, but I don't know if I'm this tough. He says, come with me. And he takes her down the street to a private stage where he rehearsed all of his routines. And he showed her that even for the great Fred Astaire, that it took very hard work and dedication to make it look so easy. If you've seen Fred Astaire dance, it's magical, right? The guy is like unreal. He just drifts, and everything's perfect, and every step is in place. And when he turns around, it's always perfect. And there it wasn't not perfect. And he said, you see, this is how it is. So she was kind of inspired by that, very inspired by that. There's a picture of Fred Astaire and my mom a little later, but isn't that a magical picture of the two of them, even later in life, working on a movie together? And you could see she is glued to this man, because why? He had this experience, but he also had something else. Besides incredible talent, he had passion for what he was doing. He was going to be the best at everything he did, no matter what, and nothing was going to stop him. And he was passing that along to this little girl, my mother. That's valuable stuff. There's another story that runs in parallel with this. And of course, As my mother gets a little older, there she is getting her handprints and feet prints at the Grauman's Chinese Theater courtyard. This is a huge honor. There's lots of stars on Hollywood Boulevard. It came way later. This was much earlier, and it was a big deal to get your handprints there, and it was huge honor. There's myself and my sister being taken to the sets. Oh, here's a woman who's got this drive to be the best singer, the best dancer, the funniest person. And she's being taught by the best people. But she drops a couple of kids into this world. And then unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you look at it, my dad disappears down the Nile with Elizabeth Taylor. And she's on her own with these two kids. Now, I'm sure there's a few single moms out here, maybe even one right over there. And it's like, this is not an easy gig in the middle of a giant career. You're having this huge career. People are pulling on you in every direction. You're having to make these incredible schedules. Well, guess what? We didn't miss a drop. She took us everywhere on the sets with her. We were loved. We just thought it was a normal thing to, have this lifestyle being schlepped around this way. A lot of my friends, though, they were left at home with the nannies. And that's okay. They survived. But I think that my sister and I got something through all of this. We got inspired. We saw magic being made. And this man right here behind me, that's me as a young teenager, is my grandfather, the man that raised my mother. He worked for the Southern Pacific Railroad. And he mentored my mom, obviously, earlier on. And we didn't know any of this, and my mom didn't know any of this. But one day, I was painting a fence, that exact fence, in fact. My grandfather's painting, and I said, can I get in on that? And he says, well, if we do the fence and we start the fence together, we're going to finish the fence together. I'm like, hey, no problem. So they all thought it was cute, and they took a picture of me painting the fence. A couple hours in, this gets old. Forget Tom Sawyer. The fun was over. I said, hey, I'm really done. I can't do this anymore. He said, you what? I said, I can't do this anymore. And he said, there is no word in your vocabulary, can't. In this family's vocabulary, can't. Now, at the time, I didn't realize I'd been drummed into my mother, and explains a lot why she even got out from underneath the piano. But it's a good lesson in life. Now, there are certainly things that you may not want to do. Now the word won't might come into play. This leads to stage stuff. We were very young. My sister and I were brought onto stages with my mother. You could see Carrie seems to be having a ball. I personally was not thrilled with the whole concept because, when you're a young man and all of a sudden they take you to Vegas, that's me on the guitar up there, and they say we're in this show, 2 shows a night, this town, 30 days straight, below the summer, and you have to wash your hair every day. And the makeup has to come on and off. Now you got to wash your face every day. Impossible for an 11-year-old to conceive of. Very hard for me. And I think this was instrumental in turning me off to in front of the camera, and I preferred behind the scenes. And I had the great privilege of being mentored by a lot of great people, and this led to me getting into the technical sides. Meanwhile, another little 19-year-old, you see the girl with the buns? Ironically, she's 19 years old. Guess who else is 19 years old doing Singing in the Rain? My mother, Debbie Reynolds. Why is that? I have no idea. One of the most influential musicals of all time is Singing in the Rain. Carrie goes on. She gets this call to do an audition for a B science fiction movie, kind of on the lower budget side. And if you watch the screen test, it's pretty strange to watch. And you certainly would have no idea where we're all headed. And we didn't know. In fact, what happened is I was told to go check on Carrie in London, which I did. I flew there and I went and saw they were great sets, much like these. And it was impressive, but there's a lot of blue screen area here where the effects were going to go later. No one saw any of the effects. He's over budget. The studio thinks the guy's lost his marbles, literally. George, hey, everybody now, George Lucas is a genius. Back then, I swear to you, there was maybe 2 people, and fortunately, Coppola was one of his good buddies and stepped up, and the movie wouldn't have been finished without Coppola. Long story short, the movie, of course, does get made. I'm sitting in a parking lot going to the screening of Star Wars on the back lot just before it came out, And Carrie is chain smoking and a Coca-Cola drinking and chain smoking, pacing. And I'm like, hey, this thing's getting ready to start. We got to go. She said, no, I can't go in there. Wait till everybody's in. Now we wait till everybody's in. Still a problem. Doesn't want to go in. Literally, we waited till the thing started, and we ended up in the front row, looking up as the battle cruiser flies over. And I looked at her, and she's squeezing my hand, panicked, nervous that this is the end of her career. And I said, this is no B movie. And the rest, of course, is history. And what leads beyond this is that I was recently in the courtyards over at Grauman's Chinese Theater, and they put a plaque right next to my mother of Carrie. And it's the only mother-daughter team in that courtyard. And Carrie was a powerful woman. My mother was a powerful woman. They were people that stared down adversity and overcame it. They did it by saying there's no can't. My mother was famous for Molly Brown. In fact, this is the Molly Brown chair. This is my mother's Oscar that she won later in life. After you work really hard and you say never, and you say there's no word can't, and you're a great humanitarian, which is what this is for, the Jean Hersholt Humanitarian Award, they give you one of these. They don't hand them out real easy. I brought that because it's not that she never did anything for an award. She never even wanted credit for things. She did it because it was the right thing to do. She did it because it was the right thing for the children. She did it because it was for her fans. We were trained at a very early age that we had to include the fans as part of our family. Because without them, she would have no career. There would be no movie stars without the fans. So Carrie eventually also came to that conclusion. And she was able to overcome great adversity. She had bipolar disorder. And she had drug challenges. Back to the human condition. These are all the stories that we all tell, right? We all have problems in our families. I just wrote a book somewhere around here. And it's about my girls. And it's a story, though, just like what we're talking about. This is not a story, although it does take place in an affluent, sort of flashy world. I call it the Downton Abbey of Beverly Hills. But it is still just a regular story about people overcoming problems in the human condition. And then one day, you could imagine that you could become such a famous person, not so much for your Star Wars thing, but also for inspiring people, to allow people to overcome their problems. Carrie was, I think, my biggest hero in that respect. And here she is in the March on Washington. It's not about the politics. It's the idea that thousands of women all over the country chose Carrie to be their example of a strong woman. Look at her eyes peeking over there. That is an awesome thing. And Meryl Streep said at the end of getting her Lifetime Achievement Award, take your broken heart and make it into art. And that's what we should do. Take all of our lives, all of our stories, and make them into art. That will make Carrie happy. Thank you.